Okay, so picture this, right? You've got this couple showing off their daughter to a friend, and the dad's like, "Oh, she's so smart. Watch this, watch this." And she's only like 18 months old, but he's like convinced she's like a genius or something.
Wow.
So he calls her over, and the little girl, she coddles over to him, looks right at him, and says, "Mama."
She knows who's boss.
And the dad is just beaming, right? Turns to his friend like, "See? I told you, she's practically talking already, saying half a word."
Ah, that's great.
I know. It kind of makes you laugh, but it also makes you think, right? Like the dad was so focused on his own interpretation of what she was saying, he totally missed the actual word.
Yeah, he was projecting his own hopes onto her instead of really listening.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today, that whole idea of interpretation and ego. We're exploring the teachings of Osho, specifically from chapter 7 and 8, part 3 of the Book of Wisdom.
Yeah.
Osho had some really fascinating things to say about this, especially the connection between ego and something we usually see as the opposite of ego, humbleness.
It's interesting, right? Because Osho really challenges that traditional understanding of humbleness. He argues that what we often think of as humility, as being humble, it's not actually the opposite of ego. He says it's more like a diluted ego, like a watered-down version of the same thing.
Yeah, and he uses this really vivid metaphor to get that point across. He talks about removing the poisonous teeth of a snake.
Right. But the snake itself.
It's false. He actually says, and I quote, "Those teeth were false because the snake itself is false."
Such a powerful image, and it perfectly illustrates his point. He's saying that true enlightenment, true freedom from ego, isn't about just suppressing it or trying to be humble.
It's about recognizing that the ego itself is an illusion.
Yes. It's like trying to get rid of a shadow without dealing with the object that's casting the shadow in the first place.
Okay, I love that analogy. But how does that actually play out in our everyday lives?
Yeah.
Because most of us aren't wandering around in some ashram in India trying to reach enlightenment 24/7.
That's the thing. It's so easy to get caught up in appearances, right? In trying to project a certain image to the world. We build these facades, these carefully curated personas, instead of looking inward at who we truly are.
We spend so much time trying to convince everyone, and maybe even ourselves, that we've got it all figured out.
Exactly. And in doing that, we miss out on actually experiencing life fully, imperfections and all.
So what's the takeaway here? How do we start to dismantle this illusion of the ego, this snake, as Osho calls it? And how do we stop focusing on just the teeth, those surface-level attempts to suppress it?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, right? How do we dismantle this illusion?
Right.
And Osho suggests that a powerful place to start is with this idea of embracing the power of yes.
He talks a lot about that in these chapters.
He does.
And I've always found it a little confusing. What does he really mean by saying yes to life? It's not like he's advocating for just blindly accepting everything that comes our way, is he?
No, not at all. It's not about being passive. It's not about just letting things happen to you. It's more about approaching life with an open heart, a willingness to embrace all of it. The good and the bad, the highs and the lows.
Embrace everything, even the painful stuff.
Especially the painful stuff, because that's where the real growth happens, right? In those moments of discomfort, of uncertainty. Osho is really talking about a kind of surrender.
Surrender. Okay, now that sounds even scarier to some people than just saying yes to everything.
I know. But it's not about giving up. It's not about being weak. It's actually a deeply courageous act to surrender to what is, to trust the flow of existence, even when we don't understand it.
It's interesting you mentioned surrender, because that makes me think about something else Osho talks about that I've always found really interesting. The word amen.
Yeah, he has a really unique take on that.
He does. It's traditionally a religious term, right?
Right.
But Osho uses it in a much broader sense.
Exactly. He's expanding its meaning beyond just blind acceptance of religious dogma. He talks about amen as a deep affirmation of life itself, of saying yes to the mystery of existence.
So it's like this deep trust in something bigger than ourselves.
Exactly. Even when it doesn't necessarily make logical sense.
Even when we don't know all the answers.
And it all circles back to surrender, doesn't it? This idea of letting go of control, of trusting the unfolding of life.
And trusting ourselves, too, I think. Trusting that we have the inner strength to navigate whatever comes our way. This idea of saying yes to our authentic selves. It really challenges a lot of the societal norms we're conditioned to follow, especially around masculinity and femininity. And Osho definitely had some strong opinions about that.
He did. He was really critical of those rigid gender roles that society tries to impose on us. He believed that true liberation comes from embracing our authentic selves, regardless of whether they fit neatly into those boxes of masculine or feminine.
Right. He basically said that trying to fit ourselves into those boxes is just another form of ego, isn't it?
It is. It's about recognizing that there's value in both,
Hmm.
in the masculine and the feminine, in the yin and the yang.
He even went so far as to warn about women's liberation potentially backfiring if it just becomes about women mimicking men.
And that's a really important point, right? Because it's not about one being better than the other, or one gender trying to be more like the other.
It's about recognizing the unique strengths and qualities that each brings to the table.
Precisely. And honoring those. So how do we challenge those traditional roles without losing the valuable aspects of both masculinity and femininity?
Right, because it's not about erasing the differences. It's
Exactly.
about celebrating them.
Yes, and recognizing that those differences are actually what make life interesting. They're what make us human.
I feel like we get so caught up in this either-or mentality that we forget about the and. Can we be strong and nurturing, assertive and compassionate?
Exactly. And that's what Osho is really pushing us to consider.
Can we embrace the full spectrum of human experience, regardless of gender?
Osho is really prompting us to redefine what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, and ultimately what it means to be fully human, to break free from those limiting definitions and step into our most authentic selves.
It takes courage to define yourself on your own terms, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And it all starts with that yes.
It takes courage, but it also takes a shift in perspective, I think.
Yeah.
And that reminds me of that metaphor Osho uses about the boat reaching the other shore.
Oh, yeah. The idea of enlightenment as a destination.
Exactly. Like we're all in this little boat, rowing and rowing, trying to get to this magical other shore where everything will be perfect and we'll finally be happy.
And Osho completely flips that on its head, doesn't he?
He does. So for anyone who hasn't heard this one before, can you kind of break down that metaphor for us?
Sure. So Osho uses this image of the boat reaching the other shore to illustrate how we often view enlightenment as this distant goal, this thing we have to struggle and strive for. And we think that once we reach that destination, once we achieve that goal, then we'll finally have found it. Lasting peace, happiness, enlightenment.
Right, like it's this reward waiting for us at the end of some long and arduous journey.
Yeah, exactly. But Osho's point is that this whole pursuit of enlightenment, this idea that it's something we have to attain, it's a fundamental misconception.
So it's not about the destination, it's about the journey itself.
It's not even about the journey. He says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically says that enlightenment is not a journey in space or time. It's an instantaneous awakening. It's about recognizing that the other shore, that state of peace and fulfillment we're all searching for, it's not some far-off land. It's right here, right now.
It's about waking up to the truth of our existence in this very moment instead of chasing some future state of being.
Exactly. And I've definitely been guilty of that in my own life, getting so caught up in goals and to-do lists that I forget to just be present, to appreciate the simple fact that I'm alive, that I'm breathing.
Yeah, I think we all do that to some extent, don't we?
We do. We get so fixated on what's next, on what we need to accomplish, that we miss out on the beauty of what is, on the miracle of this present moment.
It's like we're always looking for something outside ourselves to fulfill us, when everything we need is already within.
It is, and that's a pretty radical shift in perspective, isn't it?
It is. So how do we make that shift? How do we start to wake up to that truth? How do we start to experience this paradise that Osho describes?
I think it starts with awareness, with paying attention to our thoughts and actions, noticing when we get caught up in that cycle of striving and seeking, and then gently guiding ourselves back to the present moment, to this breath, to the sensations in our bodies.
It sounds so simple when you put it like that.
It is simple, but simple doesn't mean easy.
Very true.
It takes practice. It takes a conscious choice to shift our focus from seeking to appreciating, from striving to simply being. But the more we practice, the easier it becomes.
And the more we start to experience those moments of peace and contentment that we've been searching for all along.
Exactly. Because
Yeah.
they were never really lost. We just forgot how to access them.
That's a beautiful way to put it, and a perfect note to end on, I think. This has been such an insightful conversation. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today.
My pleasure. Always happy to be here. And remember, the journey starts with a single step, or, in Osho's words, with a single yes.
And on that note, thank you all for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.